Building your own fantasy terrain doesn't have to be complicated or expensive. Using just a few basic supplies, I was able to build this fantasy terrain piece myself. So, I'm going to show you how exactly to scratch build your very own fantasy terrain, using simple steps and materials you probably already have at home. If you've ever built something using only cardboard, you know that over time it tends to warp a little bit. To circumvent this, I'll be building this house on top of this piece of styrofoam. Styrofoam is great because it doesn't warp over time and it has a nice flat bottom. And most importantly, it's also free. At this stage, I'm also planning out where the windows will go. Since I want to add a light inside, I need to cut out the windows beforehand. So I cut holes in both the styrofoam and the cardboard to match. But how do I securely attach the cardboard to the foam without it falling off over time? For this I use two things: glue and some wooden skewers. I apply the glue between the cardboard and the foam and I use the skewers to pin them down. This will hopefully prevent the cardboard from warping and it keeps the cardboard from shifting while the glue dries. I also forgot to add the triangular pieces of the sides of the wall where the roof will be attached to. So I just cut those out separately and I use some more wooden skewers to hold them in place. Like most of you, I don't have easy access to XPS foam, but I do want to add some nice brickwork to the corners of this building. To do this, I use some more styrofoam, and I'll show you a nice trick to hide the texture as well. I cut it into thin brick shapes and glued them onto the corners of the building. Use a sharp knife for this and use multiple passes. If you apply too much pressure, it might tear the styrofoam, and this will leave you with a torn, ugly finish which will be harder to cover up later. So really just let the knife do the cutting, don't force it through the styrofoam. I then placed all the bricks one by one, gluing them down using some more wood glue. Now that the glue has dried, the bricks are still looking a bit too pristine. So, using a pen, I widened the gaps between all the bricks and I also carved in some cracks into some of the bricks. I gently pushed it into the foam to leave some indentations and also rounded over some of the sharper edges. I also ended up adding a small stone step up for the door. This was made out of styrofoam as well. Again, when cutting a piece of styrofoam to size, do make sure to make multiple passes and not push too hard, as this will create a very ugly texture which is a lot harder to cover up. And I then used a pen to carve some lines into the step up to make it look like the step up was made out of multiple smaller bricks. And I then attached this piece of styrofoam to the building using some more wood glue and 2 more pieces of wooden skewer. I then covered up the ugly styrofoam texture. To do this, I mixed up some wood filler with black paint. The filler is there to add the texture and the black paint is to give it a grey color. This is nice because if the filler ever cracks, it won't show the white insides of the filler, but it will be grey just like the bricks. And this way it won't stand out as much. I stippled it on thinly to prevent brush strokes from being visible. Don't apply this too thickly though, as it might crack while drying. Now that that's all dry, the styrofoam texture should be all covered up. This might take a few coats however. I ended up applying about 2 or 3 coats of this. This also makes it a lot harder, which hopefully makes it last a lot longer, as styrofoam on its own is quite soft. To make a door, I used some of the wooden skewers I used before. I simply cut the skewers to length and glued them onto a piece of cardstock. And for the door handle, I used one of these round donut shaped beads I got from a bead set I bought at a local discount store. I used some tweezers to attach the bead to the door, as this was quite fiddly. And then I used some more wood glue to glue the door to the actual building itself. To cover the sides, I used wooden coffee stirrers. I want this house to look like the walls are made of wooden paneling, to make it hopefully look like something similar to this. I started at the bottom and worked my way up, overlapping each coffee stirrer a little bit to create this staggered wooden panel look. I mainly used some wood glue to glue these coffee stirrers on, but I also used some super glue to make sure it wouldn't shift while the wood glue was drying. This ended up taking so much time. Like so much time. And also way more coffee stirrers than I expected, like way more. I even had to give the back of the building a different pattern because I was about to run out of coffee stirrers. I thought I had like a ton of coffee stirrers, but it took so many to cover all the sides of the building. For the frame around the door I also used coffee stirrers. The windows will let light through, so I need to add those after I painted everything. So I won't glue the windows on just yet. To create roof tiles I usually use the same easy method. It's a little time intensive, but it looks amazing. To create the roof tiles I use cardstock, which is thin cardboard usually used for things like cereal boxes and other food packaging. It's even nicer to use if you cut them into neater square pieces beforehand. It's a lot easier to work with and you won't have any torn edges, for example. Just make sure you use a sharp hobby knife for this. I used a ruler to cut straight strips of cardboard 2 cm wide, which I then cut into 1 cm long tiles. I want the roof to look similar to this picture, so I rounded off one side of each of those roof tiles using some scissors. To do this, I just eyeballed the round over, no need to measure this exactly, as this will take like a lot of time if you do. And it already did, this took way more time than I expected. So if you want to save some time, I suggest keeping them rectangular. The first batch I made wasn't even enough to cover the roof, so I had to make even more, and it took forever. I drew some lines 1 cm apart on the cardboard I was going to use for the roof to keep the tiles aligned. To glue them onto the roof, I used some more wood glue. And then they were glued on one by one, starting at the bottom. And with each new row, I offset them by half a tile to get a nice overlapping effect. Once the glue was dry, I cut off the overhanging roof tiles, but before I could glue the 2 sides of the roof to the building, I had to do something else first. To get the light source into the building, I'm gonna use some cheap LED candles. But the LED candles I'm using aren't very bright. So, to get the most out of it, I wanted to cover the insides of the building using some aluminium foil. This will hopefully reflect most of the light out where I want it to go. Once that was done, I glued on both sides of the roof using some hot glue. Now there's only 2 things I still have to take care of, which are the exposed cardboard edges on the side and the part where the 2 roof parts come together. To cover up the sides, I wanted to make some wooden beams, and to do this I used some chopsticks. To cut them to length, it's best to use a hobby saw, but since I don't have a hobby saw, I simply scored the chopsticks at the length I wanted them to be using my hobby knife. And if you break it after scoring it, the break will be very clean and precisely where you scored the line. Using my hobby knife, I then flattened one side of the chopsticks, which I was gonna glue to the roof, and then I also carved in a bunch of detail to the chopsticks. I just cut out a bunch of chunks to break up the perfectly uniform, smooth sides, and I used this metal brush as well to scratch the surface of the chopsticks. I also cut out a notch so the chopsticks can overlap, mimicking real life cabin wood joinery. To cover the point where the sides of the roof meet, I cut out some 2 by 3 cm squares using some more cardstock. I folded them over and glued them on one by one using some hot glue. At this point, we're about ready to finally add some paint. Everything was primed using a cheap dollar store spray primer. Since I don't want paint to get on the aluminium foil, I covered the windows using some masking tape. So after the priming, I had to remove the masking tape and paint the area around the windows using some more black paint. I want to paint the roof green, similar to the image I showed before. So to keep it even more budget friendly, as a base coat I tried using some cheap green hobby store paint. However, the coverage absolutely sucked. I tried priming it again with grey to get better coverage, but this cheap paint was still not good enough. So in the end I just ended up using actual hobby paints to paint the roof. I started with a darker green and made the following 2 layers slightly brighter, making sure to cover slightly less area with the lighter greens to give it a bit of a highlight and to keep the recesses darker. I then dry brushed a light green with some yellow mixed in onto the roof tiles. When doing this, make sure to go up against the direction of the tiles to catch all the edges nicely. Now let's move on to the wooden panels on the side of the building. The wooden panels were painted using a khaki paint. And after all of that was done and dry, I applied a brown wash all over it to darken it down a little bit and give it a little bit more depth and warmth. For the doors I used a slightly darker color to differentiate it from the rest of the wooden paneling. And for the beams I used the same brown color but slightly darker once again. However, after applying it to both the beams and the door, I didn't like the color of the door. So I repainted it using the same color as I used for the beams on the roof. And then I moved on to painting the bricks on the building. As a base coat I used a dark grey color. And after that I applied a few different colored washes over some of the bricks to give them a slightly different color. Once all of that had dried, I dry brushed over the bricks, the wood paneling, the beams on the roof and the door using an off-white color. I then gave the door and the roof beams a brown wash to give it some more warmth and depth as well. And I applied a black wash over all of the bricks and the roof tiles. I applied the wash on the roof while holding the building upside down, so any pooling of the wash would happen underneath the roof tiles, which creates a bit more of a shadow, instead of it pooling on the edges of the tiles. After all the washes had dried, I wanted to bring back some of the vibrancy and texture. So I dry brushed the bricks, door and wooden beams again using the same off-white color. And I did the same for the roof tiles using a light yellow color. I also painted the door handle using a metallic paint. And do you remember the cracks we carved into the bricks at the start? Those could use some accentuation in my opinion, because just dry brushing doesn't bring them out as much. So to do this, simply stipple some of the same off-white we used before onto the edges of the cracks which are facing up. This really highlights them quite nicely in my opinion. No building ever looks perfectly pristine, so I think we need to add just a little bit of dirt and wear. I have a glass jar full of sponge pieces on my desk, and I used one of those to stipple some streaking grime onto some of the wooden paneling and on the roof tiles. Don't go overboard with this though, a little goes a long way here. We're not painting a sci-fi grimdark terrain piece after all. And now the only thing left to do is make the window frames. I cut some more pieces of coffee stirrers to size and glued them together. To create some of the slimmer beams on the windows, you can simply cut some of the coffee stirrers lengthwise using your hobby knife. Once the glue had dried, I primed them using the same grey primer I used before on the rest of the building. I then gave them a quick coat of paint, similar to how I painted the doors and the roof beams. Since I want the windows to let light through, I'm going to use some clear plastic packaging. I scuffed it up using some sandpaper to create a bit of a frosted effect, as I don't want you to be able to actually look inside. And after the paint was dry, I glued them onto the window frames and then onto the building itself. And now the last thing I need to do is glue in the LED candles. I marked out the area I needed to cut out on the bottom and used my hobby knife to remove it. Then I pushed the LEDs into the building and attached them using some hot glue. Honestly, I'm quite happy with the result. The LEDs aren't super bright though, so I might just replace those in the future. And is there anything you would have done differently? Please let me know in the comments. And if you want to make something like this for yourself, you might just want some more tips to make stuff for free. So check out this video where I give you 5 free hobby hacks to help you build some amazing terrain. Thank you for watching.